June 22, 1940. In a forest near inside the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. A new armistice was signed. This time, the roles were reversed. France, a nation that had stood as a bastion of European democracy, a global empire with what was considered one of the most powerful armies on the continent, had fallen. The Third Republic was no more. The world watched in stunned disbelief. How could this have happened? Just 6 weeks earlier, the German war machine had launched its blitzkrieg through the Ardennes. The combined forces of France, Britain, and their allies, who had expected a repeat of the static trench warfare of the Great War, were completely out. The speed of the German advance was terrifying, a relentless mechanized wave that shattered defenses and sowed chaos. The British Expeditionary Force, pushed to the brink at Dunkirk, executed a miraculous but desperate evacuation. While it saved over 300,000 soldiers, it was a retreat, not a victory. All their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles was left behind on the beaches. As the last boats departed, France was left to face the onslaught alone. The government fled Paris, which was declared an open city, to spare it from destruction. The political will to fight evaporated. Marcel Pétain, a hero of Verdun from the First World War, rose tout pour, advocating for an armistice to end the bloodshed. He believed further resistance was futile, and so, on that fateful June day, France officially surrendered. The speed of its collapse sent shockwaves across the globe, from Washington to Moscow. If France could fall, who was safe? For Britain, now standing as the last major European power opposing Hitler, the situation was beyond dire. It was catastrophic. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had only recently taken office, now faced his nation's darkest hour. He had tried desperately to keep France in the fight, even proposing a Franco-British Union, a single, unified nation to continue the war. But it was too little, too late. The French government rejected the offer. Now, Britain was truly alone, an island fortress bracing for invasion. Churchill's famous speeches rallied the British people, promising to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets. But rhetoric alone couldn't stop panzers. The strategic map of Europe had been redrawn overnight. German forces now occupied a vast coastline stretching from the north of Norway down to the Spanish border. From these new bases, German U-boats could more easily strike British shipping lanes in the Atlantic, and the Luftwaffe could launch bombers directly across the English Channel. The Battle of Britain was imminent, and the odds looked grim. But amidst all this chaos, one question consumed British intelligence and the War Cabinet above all others. What about the French fleet? This was no small matter. The French Navy, the Marine Nationale, was the fourth largest in the world. It was a modern, powerful force that included formidable new battleships like the Richelieu and the Jean Bart, which were more than a match for their German counterparts. It also boasted numerous cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and even an aircraft carrier. If this fleet were to fall into German hands, the balance of naval power would shift catastrophically. Combined with Germany's Kriegsmarine and the Italian Navy, this new Axis fleet could overwhelm the Royal Navy. Britain's survival depended on its control of the seas. It was the lifeline that brought food, fuel, and war materials from across the Empire and the United States. If that lifeline were cut, Britain would be starved into submission, and any hope of liberating Europe would be extinguished. The terms of the armistice were deeply concerning. Article 8 stated that the French fleet was to be collected in ports, demobilized, and disarmed under German or Italian control. The German government solemnly declared they had no intention of using the ships for their own purposes during the war. But could Hitler's word be trusted? Churchill certainly didn't think so. He had spent years warning the world about the Nazi regime and knew that Hitler had a long history of breaking promises and treaties. Whenever it suited him, the risk was simply too great. The thought of battleships like the Richelieu sailing under the swastika was a nightmare scenario that could spell the end of the British Empire. The Admiralty in London began drawing up frantic plans. They tracked the location of every major French warship. Some were in ports in France, like Toulon. Others were in British ports like Portsmouth and Plymouth. A significant squadron, Force de Raid, was anchored at Mers El-Kébir in French Algeria. Still others were scattered across the globe, from Alexandria in Egypt to Martinique in the Caribbean. The dilemma facing Churchill was agonizing. The French were, until very recently, Britain's closest allies. They had fought and bled together. Attacking them would be a deeply painful, almost unthinkable act of betrayal. It could drive neutral French colonies firmly into the Axis camp and create a legacy of bitterness that would last for generations. On the other hand, inaction was a gamble that could cost Britain everything. Churchill's advisors were divided. Some urged caution, believing that the French naval commanders, fiercely proud and independent, would never allow their ships to be taken by the Germans. They argued that French honor demanded they scuttled their own fleet first. Others, however, pointed to the political chaos in France, with the new Vichy government under Marshal Pétain seemingly willing to collaborate with Germany. Who could say what orders might be given? The pressure was immense. Churchill knew that any decision he made would have profound and irreversible consequences. The fate of the war, and indeed the free world, could hinge on what happened to these ships. In the tense days following the French surrender, a series of urgent communications flew between London and the French naval commanders. British diplomats and officers tried to persuade, to reason, to secure guarantees. They offered the French sailors a choice: join the Royal Navy and continue the fight, sail to a neutral port to be interned for the duration of the war, or scuttle their ships. But the French admirals were caught in their own impossible position, torn between their duty to their new government and their ingrained animosity towards their historic naval rival, Britain. As the deadline approached and no clear resolution emerged, Churchill felt his options narrowing. He had to make a choice, a terrible, brutal choice that would lead to one of the most controversial and tragic episodes of the entire war. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit friend against friend and forever stain the relationship between these two great nations. June 1940. France has fallen. The seemingly unstoppable German war machine stands at the shores of the English Channel, masters of Europe. For Great Britain, the situation is beyond dire. It's a moment of existential crisis. Across the water, the island nation stands alone, defiant, but terrifyingly vulnerable. And in the heart of London, one man carries the weight of this apocalyptic reality on his shoulders. The newly appointed Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Imagine being in his shoes. You've just taken the helm of a sinking ship in the middle of the storm of the century. Your closest ally, the nation you fought alongside for decades, has just surrendered. The world you knew has crumbled in a matter of weeks. The future isn't just uncertain, it looks like a one-way ticket to oblivion. This wasn't just another political challenge for Churchill. It was a crucible that would define him, his nation, and the very course of modern history. And in the final week of June, from the 24th to the 27th, he would face a decision so agonizing, so fraught with peril, that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The choice he made was a brutal demonstration of what it takes to lead in the darkest of hours, a choice that involved turning on a friend to save his own family. The core of this impossible dilemma was the French Navy, Marine Nationale. This wasn't just any fleet. It was the fourth largest navy in the world, a formidable force of modern battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. For years, it had been the cornerstone of Allied naval strategy, a powerful counterweight to the German Kriegsmarine and the Italian Regia Marina in the Mediterranean. As long as this fleet fought for the Allies, or at the very least, remained neutral and out of German hands, Britain had a fighting chance. But if it were to fall under German control, the balance of sea power would shift catastrophically. The combined German and French fleets would be an unstoppable behemoth. They could sever Britain's vital supply lines from across the Atlantic, the arteries that pumped food, fuel, and weapons into the heart of the British war effort. Without those supplies, Britain would be starved into submission. The Royal Navy, stretched thin across the globe, would be overwhelmed. The Battle of the Atlantic would be lost before it truly began, and a German invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, would become not just a possibility, but an inevitability. Churchill knew this with chilling certainty. In his private notes and frantic war cabinet meetings, one single, terrifying thought dominated all others. The French fleet must not, under any circumstances, fall into Hitler's grasp. The French, in their surrender terms, had promised this wouldn't happen. The armistice signed on June 22nd included a clause, Article 8, stating that the French fleet would be demobilized and disarmed in its home ports under German and Italian supervision. The Germans even solemnly declared they had no intention of using the French ships for their own war purposes. To many, this seemed like a reasonable assurance. The French admiral, François Darlan, a man deeply proud of his navy, had given his personal word of honor that he would never allow his ships to be used by the enemy. He even issued secret orders to his captains to scuttle their vessels if the Germans tried to seize them. But for Churchill, these promises were worth less than the paper they were written on. He was a student of history, a man who understood the ruthless logic of total war. He'd seen Hitler break promise after promise, treaty after treaty. Why would this be any different? He saw the armistice for what it was, a trap. German supervision could easily become German control. A promise made under duress was no promise at all. Churchill could gamble Britain as survival on the word of a defeated government and a foe who specialized in deception. His fears were amplified by a flood of intelligence reports pouring into number 10 Downing Street. Each one was more alarming than the last. German officers were seen inspecting French naval bases. Whispers from occupied France spoke of German technical crews arriving in ports like Brest and Lorient. Was this just supervision, or the first step towards a full-scale cesure? Churchill's mind raced through the worst-case scenarios. He pictured the powerful battleships, Richelieu and Jean Bart, technological marvels, suddenly flying the swastika. He imagined them sailing alongside the German battleships, Bismarck and Tirpitz, forming a fleet that could sweep the Royal Navy from the seas. It was a nightmare vision, and from June 24th to the 27th, Churchill and his war cabinet were locked in almost continuous high-stakes meetings. The atmosphere in the cabinet war rooms was thick with tension, cigar smoke, and the grim weight of their predicament. They pored over maps, analyzed naval dispositions, and debated the unthinkable. Could they trust the French admirals to scuttle their own ships? What if they hesitated? What if German special forces seized the ships before the crews could react? Every option was terrible. Doing nothing meant betting the nation's life on a flimsy promise. Acting meant committing a terrible act of violence against a recent ally. Let's trace the fleet's locations to understand the scale of the problem. A significant portion of the French Navy, including powerful battleships and cruisers, was anchored at Mers El-Kébir, a naval base near Oran, in French Algeria. Other ships were in ports in metropolitan France, now under German occupation. Some were in Alexandria, Egypt, bottled up alongside the British Mediterranean fleet. A few had made it to British ports like Portsmouth and Plymouth. The fleet was scattered, a puzzle of immense strategic importance. Churchill's focus, however, was drawn, inexorably, to Mers El-Kébir. This was the most powerful single concentration of French naval power outside of mainland France. It was far enough from the Germans to be theoretically safe, but also under the command of French officers whose loyalty was now to the new collaborationist government at Vichy. This made it the most dangerous and unpredictable element in the entire equation. During those 4 frantic days, Churchill wrestled with his conscience and his strategic imperative. We can see in his private papers the sheer agony of this decision. He had been a lifelong Francophile. He loved France, its culture, its people. He had fought alongside French soldiers in the trenches of World War I. The idea of firing on French sailors, men who until a few days ago were his comrades in arms, was deeply repugnant to him. It felt like a betrayal. But Churchill the strategist had to overrule Churchill the sentimentalist. He famously wrote that the life of the state and the salvation of our cause were at stake. He reasoned that if he failed to act and the French fleet fell to the Germans, and Britain was subsequently defeated, history would never forgive him. Future generations would look back and ask, why did he do nothing? Why did he place his faith in Hitler's word when he knew it was worthless? He would be condemned not for acting, but for his inaction. This grim logic led him to a stark and brutal conclusion. Britain had to take control of the French fleet, by any means necessary. He devised a plan, codenamed Operation Catapult. It was a multi-pronged operation, a series of ultimatums delivered to French naval commanders across the globe. French ships in British ports would be boarded and seized at dawn. In Alexandria, the British Admiral, Andrew Cunningham, would negotiate a peaceful disarmament with his French counterpart, Admiral Godefroy, with whom he had a good personal relationship. But the main event, the heart of the operation and its most dangerous component, was aimed at Mers, a powerful British naval force, Force H, under the command of Admiral James Somerville, would sail from Gibraltar. They would present the French Admiral Genso with an ultimatum. He would be given a choice: sail with the British and continue the fight, sail to a British port for internment, sail to a neutral port like in the United States for the duration of the war, or scuttle his ships within 6 hours. If he refused all of these options, the Royal Navy would have no choice but to use force to sink his fleet. It was a declaration of war on an ally, delivered at the barrel of a gun. By June 27th, the decision was made. The orders were drafted. Churchill presented his final, chilling case to the War Cabinet. He argued that this brutal act, however painful, was essential. It would send a clear and unmistakable message to the world, and especially to the United States, whose support was critical. It would show that Britain was not going to surrender, that Britain was ruthless, determined, and would stop at nothing to survive and win. It was a demonstration of what he called a hideous course of action, but a necessary one. The cabinet, understanding the terrible logic, gave its consent. The wheels were set in motion. Admiral Somerville's fleet prepared to sail. As the last days of June 1940 ticked away, the world was unknowingly on the brink of one of the most tragic and controversial naval actions of the entire war. Churchill had made his impossible choice. He chose survival at a terrible cost. He chose to risk turning a friend into an enemy to prevent his ultimate enemy from gaining a war-winning weapon. The tragedy of Mers El-Kébir was about to unfold, a direct consequence of the desperate calculations made in the heart of London during those 4 agonizing days. Imagine this. It's July 2nd, 1940. Whose days ago? Britain and France were brothers in arms, fighting side by side against a common enemy. Now, the unthinkable is happening. A powerful British naval squadron, known as Force H, appears on the horizon off the coast of Algeria, near a port called Mers El-Kébir. Their guns are not pointed at the Germans or Italians, but at their oldest ally, the French fleet. At the helm of Force H is Admiral James Somerville, a man torn between duty and conscience. His orders, coming directly from Winston Churchill, are chillingly clear. He is to deliver an ultimatum to the French admiral, Marcel Bruno against. It's a set of choices, each one more agonizing than the last. The French must either sail their ships to British ports and join the fight, sail to a neutral port like in the West Indies to be demilitarized, or scuttle their own fleet right there in the harbor. If they refuse all options, Somerville has one final, brutal instruction: destroy the French fleet. Why this drastic measure? Britain was standing alone. After the fall of France, the British government was terrified that the powerful French navy, one of the best in the world, would fall into German hands. A German-controlled French fleet could tip the scales of the war, making a crucial invasion of Britain a very real possibility. For Churchill, this was an existential threat that had to be neutralized, no matter the cost. He saw it as a grim but necessary act of survival. On board the French flagship Dunkirk, Admiral Gonçalves receives the British envoy. The atmosphere is thick with disbelief and betrayal. These weren't enemies. They were comrades. Just weeks before, they had shared meals, planned strategies, and fought a common foe. Now, they were on the brink of firing on each other. The British officer delivering the message, Captain Cedric Holland, was a known Francophile. He had served as a naval attaché in Paris and had deep respect for the French Navy. You can only imagine the immense psychological weight on him as he presented these demands. Gonçalves was a proud, stubborn man. He felt his honor was at stake. He had given his word to his own superiors that the fleet would never fall into German hands. To him, the British ultimatum was an insult, a profound lack of trust. He saw it as a violation of French sovereignty. He couldn't just hand over his ships. The negotiations that followed were tense, hostile, and ultimately doomed to fail. Throughout the long, hot day, messages flew back and forth between the ships. Somerville, aboard his flagship HMS Hood, pleaded for a peaceful resolution. He tried to reason with Gensul, reminding him of their shared past and the greater enemy they both faced. He even offered the option of the French ships sailing to the United States for the duration of the war. But Gensul dug in his heels. He misinterpreted the British resolve, believing they were bluffing. He couldn't fathom that his former allies would actually open fire. Meanwhile, on both sides of the water, the sailors waited. The British seamen, many of whom had fought alongside the French, were filled with a sense of dread. Firing on allies was a line no one wanted to cross. The French sailors were confused and angry. They had just suffered a devastating defeat on land, and now their allies were threatening to destroy them at sea. The camaraderie that had defined their relationship had evaporated, replaced by suspicion and animosity. As the sun began to set over the Mediterranean, time was running out. Somerville's orders were absolute. He had a deadline. The British Admiralty, listening in on the radio communications, grew impatient. They feared German bombers might arrive or that the French fleet might try to escape under the cover of darkness. The pressure on Somerville was immense. Every passing minute brought them closer to a tragedy. Gensul, feeling cornered, sent a misleading message to his superiors, making it seem as if the British were only offering to have the fleet scuttled. He failed to communicate the other options, like sailing to a British or neutral port. This partial information sealed the fate of his fleet. The French Admiralty, believing their ships were about to be sunk without any reasonable alternative, ordered all other French naval forces in the Mediterranean to rush to Gensul's aid. When the British intercepted this message, they knew the window for negotiation had closed. The French were preparing to fight back. For Somerville, this was the final straw. He had tried everything. He had offered multiple ways out. Now, with French reinforcements on their way, his own force was at risk. The decision, as heartbreaking as it was, had been made for him. He had to follow his orders. The friendly greetings of the morning had soured into the grim preparations for battle. At 5:54 p.m., the first thunderous salvo from the British battleships ripped through the calm evening air. The shells from HMS Hood, Valiant, and Resolution screamed across the water, aimed directly at the anchored French ships. They were sitting ducks, trapped in the narrow confines of the harbor, unable to maneuver or properly fight back. The scene that unfolded was one of pure horror. The battleship Bretagne was hit almost immediately. A massive explosion tore it apart, and it capsized in minutes, taking nearly 1,000 of its crew to their graves. The Provence was set ablaze and had to be beached. The mighty Dunkirk, Gensul's own flagship, was severely damaged. Only the Strasbourg, a modern battlecruiser, managed to cut its mooring lines and, under a hail of fire, make a daring escape into the open sea, along with several destroyers. The British bombardment lasted for less than 15 minutes, but the devastation was absolute. The harbor of Mers El-Kébir became a scene of fire, smoke, and death. When the guns fell silent, the water was thick with oil and debris, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Nearly 1,300 French sailors were dead. It was a brutal, one-sided affair that left a deep and lasting scar on the relationship between Britain and France. In the aftermath, the world was stunned. For the British, it was a moment of profound sadness, but also a grim demonstration of their ruthless determination to continue the war. No matter what, Churchill defended the action in Parliament, calling it a melancholy but necessary duty. He wanted to send a clear message, not just to Germany, but to the United States, that Britain would never surrender and would stop at nothing to secure its survival. For the French, it was an unforgivable act of treachery. The attack fueled anti-British sentiment and was used extensively by the collaborationist Vichy regime's propaganda machine. The affair of Mers El-Kébir became a rallying cry for those who argued that Britain was no better than Germany. The sailors who survived, and the families of those who perished, would carry the bitterness of that day for generations. Looking back, the ultimatum at sea was one of the most controversial and painful decisions of the Second World War. It was a moment where the cold, hard logic of wartime strategy clashed with loyalty, honor, and human decency. It forced good men to do terrible things in the name of a greater cause. The tragedy of Mers El-Kébir serves as a dark reminder that in war, the lines between friend and foe can blur, and the choices leaders must make can be impossibly difficult. The night of July 2nd, 1940, must have felt impossibly long. For the men of the French fleet at Mers El-Kébir, and for the British sailors watching them from just over the horizon, the air was thick with tension. Two great navies, allies just weeks before, were now locked in a standoff that felt like a nightmare. As the sun began to rise on July 3rd, it cast its first light on a scene of impending tragedy. The final hours of diplomacy were ticking away, and with every passing minute, the hope for a peaceful resolution was dissolving like sea foam. This is the story of that morning, the final, desperate hours before the guns spoke. It's a story of miscommunication, of national pride, and of the strategic fears that pushed the friends to the brink of war. It is the story of how an alliance forged in the fires of one war was about to be shattered in the crucible of another. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're a young British officer, maybe a lieutenant, given the unenviable task of delivering an ultimatum to your French counterparts. You'd trained with these men, shared drinks with them, and fought alongside them against a common enemy. Now, you're rowing across the harbor in a small motor launch, the massive, silent shapes of French battleships looming over you. The paper in your hand feels heavier than lead. It contains options, but they're not real choices. The British demand was simple in its objective, but brutal in its implications. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the War Cabinet were terrified that the powerful French fleet, one of the best in the world, would fall into German hands. Under the terms of the armistice France had just signed with Germany, the fleet was to be disarmed under German and Italian supervision. The British couldn't trust that promise. Hitler was not known for keeping his word. If those ships, like the modern battleships, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, were added to the German and Italian navies, Britain's lifeline across the Atlantic would be severed. Britain would be choked into submission. So, the ultimatum presented to the French commander, Admiral Marcel Bruno Consul, gave him 4 options. 1. Sail with the British and continue the fight against Germany. 2. Sail to a British port with reduced crews, where the ships would be interned for the rest of the war. 3. Sail to a neutral port, like in the United States, and be demilitarized. Or 4. Scuttle the fleet sink, your own ships within 6 hours. If none of these options were accepted, the British Royal Navy had its orders: destroy the French fleet. For Admiral Gensoel, this was an impossible situation. He was a man of honor, sworn to obey his government. That government, now based in Vichy, had signed an armistice. A key part of that armistice was that the fleet would remain French. To hand it over to the British would be a direct violation of that agreement, a betrayal of his orders. It would be an act of treason. Furthermore, the armistice promised the ships would not be used by the Germans. Gensoul, like many French officers, took that promise at face value. To them, the British demand was an insult. It implied they lacked the honor or the courage to scuttle their own ships if the Germans ever tried to seize them. This is where the tragedy of miscommunication truly begins. The British envoy, Captain Cedric Holland, was a former naval attaché in Paris. He spoke fluent French and knew many of the French officers personally. He was the perfect man for the job, but he was never allowed to meet Admiral Gensoul face-to-face. Gensoul, feeling his honor slighted by the ultimatum, refused to see an officer of lower rank. He insisted on dealing only with his direct counterpart, the British Admiral Sir James Somerville, who was miles away on his flagship, the HMS Hood. So, negotiations happened through intermediaries. Messages passed back and forth, each one losing a little nuance, a little bit of the human connection that might have saved the day. Gensoul, for his part, wasn't entirely honest with his own superiors. When he reported the British terms to the French Admiralty, he omitted the options to sail to a neutral American port or to be interned in Britain. He presented the British ultimatum as a stark choice: join us or be destroyed. Why? Perhaps pride. Perhaps he felt those other options were just as dishonorable as the first. Whatever the reason, this partial reporting meant that the French government in Vichy only saw the most aggressive version of the British proposal. Their response was predictable. They ordered Gensoul to resist force with force. Back in the harbor, Captain Holland pleaded with Gensoul's flag lieutenant. "This is not a threat," he might have said. his voice laced with desperation. "It's a tragedy. We are still allies. We don't want to fire on you. Help us find a way out of this." The French officers would have listened, their faces grim. They understood the British fear, but they were trapped by their own orders and their own sense of duty. One French officer famously replied, "You are our friends, but you are about to do a terrible thing." Think of the disbelief on both sides. Young French sailors looking out from the decks of the Dunkirk, seeing the familiar silhouettes of British warships, ships they had recently operated alongside. Now, those same ships were clearing their decks for action. Their guns, which had been pointed at the Italian fleet just days ago, were now training on them. It was surreal. It was unthinkable. On the British side, the feeling was the same. Admiral Somerville, a man known for his humanity, was sickened by his orders. He delayed the deadline again and again, hoping for a breakthrough. He knew what was about to happen. He was about to give the order to kill men who were, until a moment ago, his comrades. He wrote later that it was the biggest political blunder of modern times and would raise the whole world against Britain. But his orders from Churchill were absolute. As the final deadline of 5:30 p.m. approached, the hope for a peaceful solution was gone. The British had mined the entrance to the harbor, trapping the French ships inside. French fighters could be seen taking off from a nearby airbase. The decks of the French ships were buzzing with activity as sailors prepared for battle. Admiral Gensoul, finally realizing the British were serious, sent a message that he would be willing to move his fleet to the West Indies. But it was too late. The communication lines were slow, and the message arrived on Somerville's flagship after the firing had already begun. At 5:54 p.m., with the Algerian sun hanging low in the sky, Admiral Somerville gave the fateful order. The 15-inch guns of HMS Hood, Resolution, and Valiant roared to life. Massive shells, each weighing nearly a ton, arced across the sky and slammed into the anchored, helpless French battleships. The first salvos were devastating. The battleship Bretagne exploded in a catastrophic fireball, taking nearly 1,000 of her crew with her. The Dunkirk and the Provence were crippled, set ablaze, their crews fighting fires and tending to the wounded under a rain of steel. It was not a battle. It was an execution. In just under 15 minutes, the pride of the French Atlantic Fleet was a smoking wreck. Over 1,200 French sailors were dead. The alliance was broken, shattered by fear, pride, and the brutal logic of war. The British had secured their strategic objective. The French ships would not fall into Hitler's hands, but the cost was immense. They had fired on their friends, creating a wound of bitterness and resentment that would fester for years. The morning of July 3rd, 1940, began with a desperate hope for peace and ended in a cloud of smoke and sorrow over Mers El-Kébir. It stands as one of the darkest and most controversial episodes of the entire war, a stark reminder that in total war, even allies can be forced to make impossible, heartbreaking choices. It's July 3rd, 1940. The sun hangs low in the Algerian sky, casting long shadows over the harbor of Mers El-Kébir. 4 days. A tense standoff has been building. The mighty British Royal Navy's Force H, commanded by Admiral James Somerville, sits just off the coast, its guns aimed squarely at the pride of the French fleet. The fall of France has created an unthinkable crisis. Britain, now standing alone against Nazi Germany, fears that the powerful French warships could fall into enemy hands, a move that would tip the scales of the war catastrophically. An ultimatum was delivered. Join the British, sail to a neutral port, or scuttle your ships. The French commander, Admiral Gensoul, refused, bound by his own orders and a deep sense of national honor. The deadline passed. Negotiations failed. Now, the moment no one wanted has arrived. Aboard his flagship, HMS Hood, Admiral Somerville is heavy-hearted. He had called it the most disagreeable and difficult task of his career. But his orders from Winston Churchill were absolute. At 17:54 local time, with no other options left, Somerville gives the fateful command. Open fire. The signal flags flutter. The radio message crackles, and history holds its breath. The quiet of the late afternoon is shattered by a cataclysmic roar. The 15-inch guns of the battlecruiser Hood, the battleships Valiant, and Resolution erupt in a coordinated fury. A salvo of 1-ton shells, each the size of a small car, screams through the air, arching across the water towards the anchored French vessels. This isn't a battle between enemies. It's a tragedy between allies, a brutal act of necessity born from desperation. For the French sailors, the first salvo is a complete shock. They were at peace, their ships moored in what they believed was a safe harbor. Many were still going about their daily routines, completely unaware of the breakdown in diplomacy just miles away. The first British shells find their mark with terrifying accuracy. One slams into the French battleship Dunkirk, the fleet's flagship, tearing through its armor and disabling its main gun turrets. Another hits the Provence, igniting fires and causing severe flooding. The French crews, caught by surprise, react with a mixture of disbelief and frantic courage. Amid the chaos and the deafening explosions, they scramble to their battle stations. The air fills with the acrid smell of cordite, smoke, and burning steel. The primary target of the British barrage is the battleship Bretagne, moored deep within the harbor. It is a vulnerable, stationary target. A 15-inch shell from either Hood or Resolution plunges deep into its hull, right near its aft magazines. The result is instantaneous and apocalyptic. A blinding flash of yellow-orange light tears the ship apart from the inside. A massive, towering column of black smoke and debris rockets into the sky. The Bretagne is engulfed in an inferno, its ammunition stores cooking off in a chain reaction of secondary explosions. The ship rolls over, capsizing in a matter of minutes, its keel turned to the sky. It becomes a steel tomb, trapping nearly 1,000 men inside. The sea around it is a horrific scene of burning oil, wreckage, and desperate men struggling for their lives. Aboard the other French ships, heroism and chaos reign side by side. On the battleship Dunkirk, even with the forward turrets knocked out, sailors race to get the ship underway, trying to escape the steel trap of the harbor. The battleship Provence, heavily damaged and on fire, is intentionally run aground by its crew to prevent it from sinking completely. The destroyer Magador attempts a valiant dash for the open sea, but a British shell hits its stern, detonating its depth charges. The entire rear of the ship vanishes in a colossal explosion, leaving it dead in the water, a burning wreck. Through the thick smoke, the French shore batteries and the surviving gun turrets on the ships begin to return fire, their shells splashing harmlessly around the distant British fleet. It's a desperate, defiant, but ultimately futile gesture. The British gunners are relentless. Their firing is methodical, disciplined, and devastatingly effective. They had practiced for this for years, but never against a former ally. For the sailors on Force H, watching the destruction through their binoculars, it's a grim and sickening spectacle. They are professionals carrying out an order, but the sight of the French ships burning, of the Bretagne's horrific end, weighs heavily on them. They see the flashes of the French guns firing back and know that behind those flashes are men they had considered comrades just weeks before. The entire action is brutal, swift, and one-sided. The French fleet, anchored and unprepared, stands little chance against the concentrated firepower of the British battleships at sea. In less than 15 minutes, the main bombardment is over. Admiral Somerville, seeing the immense damage he has inflicted, orders a ceasefire to allow the French to abandon their sinking ships. The harbor of Mers El-Kébir is a vision of hell. Smoke blankets the water, ships are burning fiercely, and the sea is littered with debris and the bodies of the fallen. The once proud French Atlantic fleet has been shattered. The human cost is staggering. In those few terrible minutes, over 1,300 French sailors lost their lives, with hundreds more wounded. It's one of the darkest and most controversial episodes of the Second World War. A moment when Britain, fighting for its very survival, turned its guns on its friends to deny a potential weapon to its enemies. The smoke eventually cleared from Mers El-Kébir, but the political and emotional fallout would linger for years. In France, the attack was seen as a treacherous betrayal, fueling anti-British sentiment and complicating the relationship between Britain and the newly formed Vichy regime. For Churchill and the British government, it was a brutal but necessary signal to the world, especially the United States, that Britain would stop at nothing to continue the fight against Hitler. Operation Catapult was a tragedy, a calculated act of violence that saved no one in the moment, but was intended to help save the future. The memory of those 1,300 sailors serves as a stark reminder of the terrible choices leaders must make in wartime, and the price of victory. The sun set on July 3, 1940, but the fires at Mers El-Kébir burned with a light of their own, casting a hellish glow over the harbor. The air, thick with the smell of scorched metal and death, was a testament to one of the most tragic and controversial naval actions of the Second World War. On this single, terrible afternoon, Allies had become enemies. For the sailors of the Royal Navy's Force H, the elation of a mission accomplished was nowhere to be found. Instead, a heavy silence fell over the British warships as they withdrew. Men who had trained alongside their French counterparts, shared drinks in port, and considered them bros in arms, now stared back at the inferno they had created. They saw the French battleship Bretagne, its back broken, capsize in a plume of smoke and steam, taking nearly 1,000 men with it. They saw the Dunkirk, a modern marvel of naval engineering, run aground and burning fiercely. The Provence, too, was beached and ablaze. These weren't just enemy ships, they were tombs for men they knew. A sense of profound shock and sorrow settled over the British fleet. One officer wrote in his diary that night, "This was the most hateful day of my life." Another described the sailors on his ship as absolutely horrified. Had followed orders? Yes, but the cost was a stain on their conscience. They were fighting a war against tyranny, yet they had just killed hundreds of their own allies. This was not a victory to be celebrated, it was a tragedy to be mourned. Aboard the surviving French ships, and on the shores of the harbor, the scene was one of apocalyptic chaos. The battleship Strasbourg, in a feat of incredible seamanship and courage, had managed to escape the trap, its crew pushing the engines to their absolute limit as British shells rained down around them. But for those left behind, the night was a desperate struggle for survival. Rescue boats weaved through the debris-choked water, pulling oil-slicked, wounded, and dazed survivors from the sea. On the decks of the damaged ships, officers and sailors fought fires and tended to the wounded with dwindling supplies. The cries of the injured mixed with the roar of the flames and the groaning of twisted steel. For these French sailors, the attack was an act of incomprehensible betrayal. They had been given an impossible ultimatum and then mercilessly shelled by a navy they had respected and trusted. The bitterness was immediate and intense. Admiral Gensoul, the French commander, watched the destruction of his fleet with a heavy heart. A fleet he had sworn would never fall into German hands. Now, it lay shattered, not by the Germans, but by the British. The pride of the French Navy was a smoldering ruin. The political fallout was just as devastating. In London, Winston Churchill defended his decision to Parliament with a heavy heart, calling it a Greek tragedy. He argued that the grim necessity of war, the absolute need to prevent the French fleet from falling into Hitler's grasp, left him no other choice. He knew the price was steep, not just in lives, but in the trust between two great nations. For many in Britain, it was a brutal but necessary act to ensure their own survival. But across the Channel, the reaction was one of pure outrage. The Vichy government in France, already collaborating with Germany, seized upon the attack as proof of British propaganda posters appeared, depicting a drowning French sailor reaching for a hand, only to be stabbed by a British dagger. The attack on Mers El-Kébir pushed France further into the arms of its German conquerors and created a wound between the two democracies that would take years to heal. For a moment, the common enemy was forgotten, replaced by a bitter, fratricidal conflict. As the fires finally began to die down in the early hours of July 4th, the full scale of the devastation became clear. Over 1,200 French sailors were dead. The harbor was a graveyard of steel. This single event laid bare the brutal calculus of total war, where strategic necessity could override friendship, honor, and even common humanity. The smoke that drifted from Mers El-Kébir was more than just the result of explosions. It was the physical manifestation of a broken alliance. It symbolized a moment when two nations, united in their democratic ideals, were forced into an act of mutual destruction by the relentless pressures of a world at war. The ripples of that day would be felt for the remainder of the conflict and beyond, a permanent scar on the history of two proud maritime nations. The battle may have ended, but the aftermath, A complex mix of grief, anger, and regret had only just begun. It was, as one historian would later write, the darkest hour between friends. July 4th, 1940. As Americans celebrated their Independence Day, a different kind of declaration was being made across the Atlantic. News of the Royal Navy's attack on the French fleet at Mers El-Kébir finally reached the streets of London. The initial reaction was one of sheer disbelief, a collective gasp that rippled through the city. How could this have happened? Attacking an ally, even a defeated one. The French, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with them just weeks before, were now the targets of British guns. It was a shocking, brutal, and deeply unsettling piece of news. For many, the first emotion was horror. The papers carried the grim headlines, and the details that trickled in painted a terrible picture. Over 1,000 French sailors killed, proud warships sunk or ablaze. These weren't just ships. They were symbols of a shared struggle that had ended in disaster. The public was stunned by the ruthlessness of the act. It felt like a betrayal, a stain on the honor of the Royal Navy. Whispers in pubs and queues turned into heated debates. Was this what Britain had become? A nation that turns on its friends. The moral weight of the decision was immense, and it fell heavily on the shoulders of the British people. But as the initial shock subsided, a different sentiment began to take hold. It was a grim, reluctant understanding. Britain stood alone. The specter of a Nazi invasion loomed larger every day. The greatest fear was that the powerful French fleet, one of the largest in the world, would fall into Hitler's hands. If that happened, the Royal Navy's control of the seas Britain's very lifeline would be catastrophically threatened. The sea was their shield, and any crack in that shield could prove fatal. This was the context that Winston Churchill had to navigate. The decision for Operation Catapult was his, and he knew he would have to answer for it. The House of Commons was a cauldron of anxiety and anger. When Churchill rose to speak on July 4th, the atmosphere was electric. This wasn't just a political speech. It was a moment that could make or break his wartime leadership. Many members of Parliament were appalled. They had personal connections with France, with its people and its military leaders. Lloyd George, the veteran statesman who had led Britain through the First World War, was particularly scathing in private, viewing the act as a tragic blunder. Churchill began his speech with a heavy heart. He described it as a Greek tragedy, acknowledging the profound sorrow of the action. He meticulously laid out the sequence of events: the fall of France, the armistice terms, and the repeated, desperate attempts by the British to secure the French fleet. He explained the offers made to Admiral Gonsalves who sailed to British ports, to the United States, or to scuttle the ships. He detailed the agonizing 6-hour wait for a decision, with German pressure mounting on the French government. His voice, filled with a mix of resolve and regret, echoed through the chamber. He didn't shy away from the brutality of the outcome. He stated plainly that he had given the order, that the responsibility was his, alone. He argued that his first duty, his only duty, was to the survival of the British nation and the cause of freedom. Faced with the mortal peril of the French fleet being turned against them, he had no other choice. It was a dreadful necessity, an act of self-preservation in the face of an existential threat. As he spoke, the mood in the chamber began to shift. The raw emotion, the cold logic, and the sheer weight of the moment began to resonate. Members who had arrived full of doubt and anger found themselves being won over, not by rhetoric, but by the stark reality. Churchill presented. When he finished, something remarkable happened. The House, which had been simmering with dissent, rose to give him a standing ovation. Even his critics were silent, acknowledging the terrible burden he carried and the impossible choice he had to make. It was a powerful display of unity, a signal that Parliament, despite its deep reservations, stood behind the Prime Minister. This parliamentary victory was a crucial turning point. It solidified Churchill's authority at a time when it was still fragile, but the true impact of Operation Catapult was felt far beyond the walls of Westminster. It sent a clear, brutal, and unequivocal message to the rest of the world, and most importantly, to two key audiences: the United States and Nazi Germany. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been watching Britain's situation with growing alarm. There were serious doubts in the American administration about Britain's will to fight on alone. Many believed a negotiated peace with Hitler was inevitable. The attack on Mers El-Kébir shattered those doubts. It was a demonstration of absolute and ruthless determination. It proved that Churchill's Britain was not going to surrender. This single act did more than any diplomatic cable to convince Roosevelt that Britain was a worthy and reliable ally, a bastion that would hold out. It was a key factor in his decision to provide Britain with the old age short of war that would be so vital in the months and years to come, starting with the Destroyers of Four Bases Agreement. Conversely, in Berlin, the news was received with a mixture of fury and grudging respect. Hitler and his high command had hoped to use the French fleet to their advantage, either by seizing it or by using its existence as a bargaining chip. The British action, in one swift stroke, removed that piece from the chessboard. It showed them that Churchill would stop at nothing to secure his island nation. Goebbels' propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting the British as treacherous pirates. But privately, the German leadership understood the signal. This was not a government that would be easily intimidated. The fight for Britain would be a fight to the death. Back home, public opinion had coalesced. The initial horror gave way to a hardened resolve. The thinking was simple and stark. If Churchill was willing to make such a terrible decision, then the situation must be truly desperate. And if the situation was that desperate, then every single person had to be just as resolute. It paradoxically strengthened morale. It was a sign that their leader was prepared to be as ruthless as the enemy. The action at Mers El-Kébir became a symbol of Britain's newfound spirit, a spirit of grim defiance. This wasn't a moment of celebration. There were no victory parades. The human cost was too high, and the circumstances too tragic. It was a somber and sobering event. But in the dark summer of 1940, with Britain's back against the wall, this brutal act served as a powerful declaration. It was a declaration that Britain would not break, would not bend, and would do whatever it took to survive. Operation Catapult reinforced the nation's morale, not through triumph, but through the shared acceptance of a terrible necessity. It was the moment Britain looked into the abyss and resolved to fight its way out. Today, we're retackling a painful and often misunderstood chapter, the immediate fallout from the British attack on the French fleet at Mers El-Kébir, an operation codenamed Catapult. In our last episode, we covered the brutal military necessity that drove Churchill's decision. Now, we'll explore the devastating political and emotional consequences of that choice. The year is 1940. The month is July. And the world is about to witness a friendship forged in the fires of World War I shatter into a million pieces. Imagine the scene in Vichy, the provisional capital of unoccupied France. The news from North Africa arrives not as a strategic report, but as a thunderclap of betrayal. Over 1,000 French sailors, men who just weeks earlier were fighting alongside the British, are dead. Their ships, the pride of the French Navy, are burning or sunk at the hands of their former allies. For Marshal Pétain's newly formed government, this was more than a tragedy. It was a political catalyst. The French public, already reeling from a swift and humiliating defeat by Germany, was now faced with an attack from the one nation they thought they could count on. The reaction was immediate and visceral. On July 5, just 2 days after the attack, the Vichy government officially severed all diplomatic ties with Great Britain. This wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a reflection of genuine, widespread public outrage. In cities across both occupied and unoccupied France, anti-British sentiment, which had been simmering beneath the surface, boiled over. Spontaneous riots broke out. British flags were torn down and burned in public squares. Businesses with British names were vandalized. The sense of betrayal was palpable. To understand this fury, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the average French citizen in July 1940. Their army had been defeated, their government had collapsed, and their country was partitioned. They were disoriented, ashamed, and desperate for a sense of stability and national pride. The armistice with Germany, while humiliating, had at least ended the fighting and the bloodshed. Then comes Operation Catapult. From the French perspective, Britain, who they felt had provided insufficient support during the Battle of France, was now kicking them while they were down, destroying their fleet and killing their sailors for a hypothetical fear. The Vichy regime skillfully harnessed this wave of anger. Propaganda posters began appearing, depicting a blood-soaked Churchill standing over the graves of French sailors. Newspapers and radio broadcasts now under Vichy control, relentlessly pushed the narrative of perfidious Albion, the treacherous British, who had always been France's true rival. This attack, they argued, proved that Pétain was right. It showed that France could not trust Britain, and that the path of collaboration, or at least neutrality, was the only way to protect what was left of the nation and its empire. The attack on Mers El-Kébir became Exhibit A in Vichy's case against Charles de Gaulle and his Free French movement in London. They were painted as traitors, puppets of a government that had just murdered their countrymen. For many French people who were previously on the fence, undecided about Pétain or de Gaulle, Operation Catapult was a decisive moment. It pushed them toward Vichy. It seemed to validate the armistice and lend legitimacy to Pétain's government. Why side with de Gaulle and the British when the British were attacking French ships? This complicated the political landscape immensely. It wasn't a simple case of collaborators versus resistors. Many who came to support Vichy did so not out of love for Germany, but out of a burning, nationalistic anger toward Britain. They saw Pétain as the shield protecting France, not just from the Germans, but from the British as well. The attack also had a profound impact on the French military, especially the Navy. The officer corps, already deeply conservative and hierarchical, was aghast. The bond with the Royal Navy, built over decades, was destroyed overnight. This animosity would linger for years, creating significant friction in later Allied operations. When the Allies landed in North Africa in 1942 during Operation Torch, for example, they were met with fierce resistance from Vichy French forces, who still remembered Mers El-Kébir. The memory of that day of infamy, as the French called it, fueled a desire for revenge and made cooperation incredibly difficult. Even within the French population, the event was divisive. While many rallied to Vichy, others saw through the propaganda. They understood, however painfully, the grim logic behind Britain's actions. They knew that Britain was now fighting alone, and the fear of the French fleet falling into German hands was a legitimate, existential threat. For these individuals, the tragedy only strengthened their resolve to join the resistance or support de Gaulle, believing that the true enemy remained Nazi Germany and that the painful break with Vichy was a necessary step toward France's eventual liberation. This created deep rifts within families and communities, pitting patriotism against patriotism. What was the right way to be a French patriot in 1940? Was it to defend French sovereignty against all comers, including the British? Or was it to join the fight against the greater evil of Nazism, even if it meant siding with those who had attacked your own fleet? So, while Operation Catapult was a military success for Britain in that it neutralized the potential threat, its political and diplomatic fallout was catastrophic. It solidified the anger of the French population, gave the Vichy regime a powerful propaganda tool, and drove a wedge between former allies that would take years to heal. It transformed the relationship from one of alliance to one of outright animosity, with Vichy France declaring Britain an enemy. This single event perfectly illustrates the tragic complexities of war, where strategic necessity can lead to heartbreaking consequences, and where the lines between friend and foe can become terrifyingly blurred. The echoes of the explosions at Mers El-Kébir would resonate throughout the war, shaping allegiances, fueling propaganda, and leaving a deep scar on the Franco-British relationship. Thank you for joining us for this analysis of a truly difficult moment in history. It's crucial to understand these complexities to get a full picture of the war. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the Second World War. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you next time. In the smoldering summer of 1940, with France on its knees, a new tragedy unfolded, not on the battlefields against Germany, but at sea, between former allies. The British attack on the French fleet at Mers El-Kébir was a brutal act of realpolitik, a desperate measure to prevent French warships from falling into German hands. But for Adolf Hitler, it was more than a military event. It was a golden opportunity, a propaganda gift he would exploit with masterful sin. This is the story of how the Nazis weaponized a tragedy to twist and demoralize a nation and paint Britain as the true villain of the war. Immediately after the Royal Navy's guns fell silent, the Nazi propaganda machine, orchestrated by the brilliant and diabolical Joseph Goebbels, Rohard de Life, German radio broadcasts which now reached every corner of occupied France, began spewing a carefully crafted narrative. The message was simple, direct, and poisonous. Britain, the supposed ally, was a treacherous, backstabbing nation. They were, in the words of Nazi broadcasters, the eternal pirates, a people who would sacrifice their friends for their own selfish interests. Imagine being a French citizen in July 1940. Your country has just suffered a catastrophic defeat. Your government has collapsed. German soldiers patrol your streets. You are disoriented, humiliated, and desperate for answers. Then, over the radio, you hear the news from Mers El-Kébir. Over 1,000 of your sailors, your countrymen, have been killed not by the Germans, but by the British. The German reports are filled with lurid, heart-wrenching details. They describe the fires, the explosions, the sailors drowning in the harbor. They paint a picture of cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The British, the broadcasts claimed, had revealed their true face. They were bloodthirsty, untrustworthy, and cared nothing for France or its people. This propaganda had a multifaceted purpose. First and foremost, it was designed to drive a wedge between the French people and their former ally. The goal was to extinguish any lingering pro-British sentiment, to sever the bonds of trust that had been forged in the First World War. Goebbels understood that if he could make the French hate the British, they would be far less likely to support any resistance movement or rally to the cause of Charles de Gaulle's Free French in London. The attack became proof that trusting Britain was a fatal mistake. The new collaborationist government under Marshal Pétain was presented as the only sensible path. Pétain had chosen peace with Germany, while Britain had chosen to slaughter French sailors. Who was the real enemy? The propaganda provided a simple, albeit deeply distorted, answer. The Nazis didn't just report the news. They amplified it, embellished it, and turned it into a grand spectacle of moral outrage. They organized public ceremonies to honor the French sailors who died at Mers El-Kébir. German officials laid wreaths. The Nazi-controlled press in Paris ran front-page headlines screaming of British perfidy. Newsreels shown in French cinemas contrasted images of German soldiers behaving correctly and even helping French civilians with dramatic footage of the burning French ships. The subtext was clear. The Germans were the civilized, honorable victors, while the British were savage barbarians. This narrative was incredibly effective in demoralizing the French population. It fed into a sense of betrayal and abandonment. Many French people, already reeling from defeat, felt that the world had turned against them. The attack seemed to confirm their worst fears. France was alone. This feeling of isolation was exactly what Hitler wanted. A demoralized and divided populace is an easily controlled populace. The anger directed at Britain was anger deflected from the German occupiers. Instead of focusing on their own subjugation, many French citizens were consumed by rage against their former friends across the Channel. Furthermore, Hitler used the incident to bolster his own moral standing, both at home and abroad. By loudly condemning the British attack, he positioned himself as a defender of decency and a protector of the French. This was, of course, the height of hypocrisy. The Nazi regime was, at that very moment, perpetrating unimaginable atrocities across Europe. The persecution of Jews, political opponents, and other minorities was escalating. The brutal realities of Nazi occupation were being systematically hidden, while the British action at Mers El-Kébir was thrust into the international spotlight. The German propaganda machine was masterful at this kind of moral duty. It took a single, morally complex event and blew it up to overshadow Germany's own systematic criminality. They framed the British decision, which was born of a desperate strategic calculation, as an act of pure malice. They conveniently ignored the fact that the entire situation was a direct result of Germany, as so an aggression and violation of French sovereignty. Had Germany not conquered France, the British would never have been faced with such a terrible choice. But this crucial context was completely erased from the Nazi narrative. For the German people, the story of Mers El-Kébir reinforced the official line that Germany was fighting a defensive war against a ruthless and morally bankrupt British Empire. It justified the ongoing conflict and steeled public resolve for the looming Battle of Britain. Goebbels' ministry ensured that every German newspaper and radio station carried the story, portraying Churchill as a warmonger with no regard for human life. It was a classic case of projection. accusing the enemy of the very sins you yourself are committing on a far grander scale. The tragedy was also a powerful tool for strengthening the Vichy regime's grip on power. Marshal Pétain and his Prime Minister, Pierre Laval, were eager collaborators who saw their political future tied to Germany. They eagerly seized upon the British attack as justification for their policy of collaboration. They argued that it proved Britain could not be trusted, and that France's only path to survival lay in cooperation with the new German order in Europe. The anti-British sentiment stirred up by the Nazis served their domestic political agenda perfectly, helping to silence critics and consolidate their authority. In essence, the summer of 1940 saw Hitler and his propaganda ministry conduct a master class in psychological warfare. They took a genuine tragedy, the deaths of over 1,000 French sailors, and twisted it into a powerful weapon. They used it to demoralize the French, to isolate Britain, to justify their own actions, and to prop up a puppet regime. It was a campaign built on half-truths and outright lies, designed to manipulate emotions and obscure the larger, monstrous truth of the Nazi project. While Britain argued that its actions were a harsh but necessary evil to win the war, Hitler presented a simple, emotionally charged story of betrayal. And in the chaos and confusion of a defeated France, that simple story found fertile ground. The echoes of that propaganda campaign would linger for years, a testament to the power of information and misinformation to shape the course of history. It serves as a chilling reminder that in times of war, the first casualty is often the truth, and a tragedy can become just another tool in the hands of those who seek to control the narrative. In the grim twilight of 1940, with France fallen and Britain standing alone, a terrible decision was made. A decision so controversial, so brutal, that even today, historians are deeply divided. I'm talking about Operation Catapult, the British attack on the French fleet at Mers El-Kébir. Was it a strategic masterstroke that saved Britain, or an unforgivable act of betrayal against a former ally? Let's dive into the strategic reality of that desperate time. The situation for Britain was beyond dire. The Wehrmacht had steamrolled across Europe. The fall of France wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological cataclysm. Suddenly, the powerful French Navy, the fourth largest in the world, was a massive question mark. Its modern battleships, like the Dunkirk and Strasbourg, and its formidable cruisers and destroyers, were now docked in ports under the control of the collaborationist Vichy government. For Winston Churchill and the British War Cabinet, the nightmare scenario was clear. What if Hitler seized this fleet? The armistice agreement between France and Germany stated the French ships would be disarmed under German or Italian supervision. But could Hitler's word be trusted? Absolutely not. If the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, absorbed these French vessels, the balance of sea power would shift catastrophically. The Royal Navy's blockade, Britain's lifeline, would be threatened. The Atlantic, the artillery carrying vital supplies from America and the Empire, could be severed. A German invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, would transform from a risky gamble into a terrifyingly real possibility. Churchill's logic was cold and hard. He couldn't afford to take the chance. He gave the French Admiral Gonsaleh at Mers El-Kébir an ultimatum with several options: sail with the British and continue the fight, sail to a British port, sail to a French port in the West Indies, or to the United States for demilitarization or scuttle the ships. If none of these were accepted, the Royal Navy had orders to destroy them. The negotiations were fraught with misunderstanding, pride, and a tragic lack of time. The French felt their honor was at stake. They had given their word they would never let their ships fall into German hands. Before the British, honor was a luxury they couldn't afford when national survival was on the line. When the deadline passed on July 3, 1940, the British warships of Force H, commanded by Admiral Somerville, opened fire. The result was carnage. The battleship Bretagne exploded, killing nearly 1,000 of her crew. The Dunkirk and Provence were heavily damaged. Over 1,200 French sailors lost their lives. It was a horrific friendly fire incident on a scale never seen before. The world was shocked. The French were enraged. The Americans, who Churchill desperately needed to bring into the war, were appalled by the brutality. But strategically, from Churchill's ruthless perspective, Operation Catapult achieved its primary objective. The core of the modern French fleet was neutralized. It sent an unmistakable message to the world, and especially to Washington, D.C. It demonstrated that Britain was not going to surrender. It showed that under Churchill, Britain would be utterly ruthless in its determination to fight on, no matter the cost. This brutal resolve helped convince President Roosevelt that Britain was a worthy investment, a nation that would see the fight through to the end. This action secured the Royal Navy's dominance in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. At a critical moment, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies above southern England that summer and autumn, the Royal Navy stood as the unbreachable guardian of the seas. The German surface fleet, der Kriegsmarine, was already small. It had suffered significant losses during the invasion of Norway. Without the French ships, it stood no chance of challenging the Royal Navy for control of the English Channel. This naval supremacy was the silent, decisive factor that doomed Operation Sea Lion before it even began. The German army could not cross the Channel if the Royal Navy was there to sink its transport bark. Hermann Rehn, head of the Luftwaffe, promised he could destroy the Royal Air Force and gain air superiority, a prerequisite for any invasion. But even if he had succeeded, which he didn't, the Kriegsmarine itself admitted it could not protect an invasion fleet from the guns of the Royal Navy. The sea was Britain's wall, and Operation Catapult had ensured that wall remained impenetrable. So, how do we judge this event today? Historians who defend the action point to the strategic necessity. They argue that in total war, with a nation's existence at stake, leaders must make terrible choices. The risk of the French fleet falling into German hands, however small some might argue it was simply too great to bear. They see it as a grim but essential act of self-preservation. It was a clear signal of Britain's fighting spirit. On the other hand, many historians condemn it as a tragic and unnecessary blunder. They argued that the French admirals, particularly Admiral Dallin, would have honored their pledge to scuttle their ships rather than let them be taken by the Germans. In fact, that's exactly what happened 2 years later in Toulon, when German forces tried to seize the remainder of the French fleet. The French scuttled their own ships, proving their commitment. These critics say the attack was a stain on Britain's honor, drove a wedge between allies, and created a legacy of bitterness that lasted 4 years. It was, in their view, a panicked overreaction that resulted in the needless deaths of Allied sailors. There is no easy answer. It's a classic case of strategic reality clashing with moral principles. Operation Catapult was a brutal, bloody affair that shattered an alliance, but it also played a crucial role in the complex calculus of survival in 1940. By ensuring the Royal Navy remained supreme, it guaranteed that Britain would live to fight another day, to serve as the unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the liberation of Europe would eventually be launched. The debate over Mers El-Kébir forces us to confront the ugliest aspects of war, where choices are not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. It remains one of World War II's most painful and controversial what-ifs. 1942. The world is engulfed in a war that has shattered empires and forged the most unlikely of alliances. For Britain and the fledgling Free French movement, the path forward is paved with necessity, but haunted by the ghosts of the past. Just 2 years earlier, the Royal Navy had turned its guns on its former ally at Mers El-Kébir, a brutal act of realpolitik that sent shockwaves through both nations. Now, as the tide of war begins to turn, these two fractured partners must find a way to reconcile, to rebuild a trust that was quite literally blown apart. This is the story of that reconciliation, a long, arduous road back from the brink, defined by two towering figures, Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle. Imagine the tension in the room whenever they met. De Gaulle, the very personification of French honor, could never truly forget the sight of French ships burning and French sailors dying at the hands of their supposed friends. For him, Mers El-Kébir was a stain, a betrayal that cut to the core of his mission to restore France's sovereignty and pride. He saw it as a cynical calculation by a British Empire that, when push came to shove, prioritized its own survival above all else, even the lives of its allies. He carried this wound with him, a constant, simmering resentment that colored every interaction, every strategic decision, every negotiation. On the other side stood Churchill, the bulldog prime minister, a man who bore the immense weight of his nation's survival. He never apologized for the decision. In his mind, it was a terrible but necessary choice made at Britain's darkest hour. With France defeated and its powerful fleet's fate uncertain, the risk of it falling into German hands was a nightmare scenario he could not permit. Churchill would try to explain his reasoning to de Gaulle, framing it not as an act of malice, but as a tragic necessity of war. He'd speak of the desperate gamble, the fear that gripped London in the summer of 1940. He argued that the brutal message sent at Mers El-Kébir was aimed not at France, but at Berlin and Washington, proving Britain's unbreakable will to fight on, alone if it had to. But explanations, no matter how logical, could not erase the memory of over 1,000 dead French sailors. The relationship remained frosty, punctuated by moments of outright hostility. De Gaulle was famously difficult, stubbornly asserting Free France's authority at every turn, often to the immense frustration of Churchill and the Americans. He was suspicious of British motives in the Levant, in Madagascar, in North Africa. Seeing London's hand everywhere, always wary of a new betrayal, a new attempt to usurp French influence for British imperial gain. The British, in turn, often saw de Gaulle as arrogant, ungrateful, and impossibly obstinate. Churchill famously grumbled that the cross of Lorraine de Gaull's symbol was the heaviest cross he to bear. Yet, despite this deep-seated animosity, the logic of the war was inescapable. They needed each other. Britain needed the legitimacy that de Gaulle's Free French movement provided. They needed French resistance networks, French colonial territories as staging grounds, and French soldiers to fight alongside them. The Free French, on the other hand, were utterly dependent on British support for their very existence. They relied on British funding, British weapons, and the BBC's airwaves to broadcast their message of hope and defiance back to occupied France. London was their base of operations, their lifeline, shared enemy, shared goals. This was the cold, hard calculus that forced them together. The turning point, arguably, was Operation Torch in November 1942, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Initially, the Allies, particularly the Americans, sidelined de Gaulle, choosing instead to negotiate with Vichy French commanders on the ground. The move was a calculated snub, and it infuriated de Gaulle, but it also backfired. The complex and often treacherous politics of Vichy North Africa proved that dealing with collaborators was a messy, morally compromised business. It inadvertently highlighted de Gaulle's own unwavering, principled stance. As the campaign progressed, it became clear that only de Gaulle could genuinely rally the French Empire to the Allied cause. His influence and legitimacy, once questioned, were now undeniable. Slowly, pragmatism began to chip away at the wall of resentment. Joint military operations required cooperation. Intelligence sharing was vital. The planning for the eventual invasion of France itself, Operation Overlord, made their partnership absolutely essential. Churchill, for all his frustrations, began to recognize de Gaulle not just as a symbol, but as the inevitable future leader of a liberated France. He started to advocate for de Gaulle more forcefully with the skeptical American president, Franklin Roosevelt. It wasn't about friendship, it was about winning the war and ensuring a stable, friendly France in the post-war order. Think about the psychological toll for the soldiers, sailors, and airmen on the ground. This was a bizarre reality. One day you might be fighting alongside a British commando. The next you'd be hearing stories of the betrayal at Mers El-Kébir. Trust had to be rebuilt, not just in the halls of power, but in the trenches, on the decks of ships, and in the briefing rooms of air bases across the world. It was a slow, uneven process built on shared sacrifice. When a French pilot flew cover for a British bomber, or a British submarine supplied a French resistance cell, those were the small acts that began to mend the enormous breach. By 1944, as the Allies prepared to land in Normandy, the relationship had evolved. It was never warm. It was never easy. The ghost of Mers El-Kébir never fully vanished. It would linger as a scar on the Franco-British relationship for decades. But the shared objective of liberating France and defeating Nazi Germany had become the overriding priority. De Gaulle's stubbornness, once seen as a liability, was now understood as a fierce, unshakable patriotism, the very quality France needed to rise from the ashes. Churchill, the man who had given the order to fire, was now the man ensuring de Gaulle had a seat at the table, recognizing that the future of Europe depended on a strong, restored France. The road from Mers El-Kébir to the Champs-Élysées was long and fraught with peril, suspicion, and personal animosity. But it was a road they had to travel together. The alliance was reforged, not in the warmth of friendship, but in the crucible of total war. A testament to the powerful, often brutal, logic of a shared struggle for survival. It's a stark reminder that in the grand sweep of history, nations can be bound together by common purpose, even when they are divided by bitter memory. The guns fell silent in 1945, but for the survivors of Mers El-Kébir, the war was far from over. For them, and for France, a new battle began. The battle for memory. How could they make sense of an attack not by the enemy, but by their oldest ally? In the years that followed, memorials rose from the soil of Brittany into stark white stone, etched with the names of the 1,300 sailors who perished on that single July day in 1940. These were just monuments. They were declarations. They were a testament to a loss that many outside of France struggled to comprehend, a wound inflicted by a friend's hand. For the French sailors who lived, men like Marcel Bouguer, who watched his ship, the Bretagne, capsize in a sea of fire. The memories were a constant, unwelcome guest. They had been ordered not to fight the British, their comrades in arms just weeks before. They had trusted in that alliance. And then, the shells rained down. For them, the question wasn't about grand strategy or geopolitical necessity. It was about betrayal. It was about the faces of friends lost in an instant, the smell of smoke, the screams that echoed long after the explosions faded. Their stories, often shared only in quiet naval circles, painted a picture of confusion, horror, and a deep, lingering bitterness. Across the Channel, a different kind of reflection was taking place. In the hallowed halls of British academia, and in the memoirs of its wartime leaders, the debate over Mers El-Kébir raged. Was it, as Churchill maintained until his dying day, a deadly, hateful, but necessary act? Or was it a catastrophic moral failure, a bloody stain on Britain's honor? The case for necessity was built on the grim reality of 1940. Britain stood alone. The fall of France was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake. The fear that the powerful French fleet, the fourth largest in the world, could fall into Hitler's hands was palpable. If Germany gained control of those battleships, the Royal Navy's blockade Britain's very lifeline could be broken. The Atlantic would become a German lake. An invasion would be inevitable. From this perspective, the attack was a brutal but essential message sent not just to Hitler, but to the world, and especially to America. The message was clear. Britain will not surrender. We will fight on, no matter the costs, no matter how terrible the means. The survival of the nation, they argued, trumped all other considerations. It was a cold, hard calculation of risk, but the counterargument was just as powerful, and perhaps more troubling. Critics pointed out that the French commander, Admiral Gensoul, had given his word of honor that his ships would never be used by the Germans. He had even proposed multiple compromises, including scuttling the fleet himself if the Germans or Italians made a move. Was this not enough? Did Britain's panic and mistrust override sound judgment? Historians on this side of the debate argue that the attack was a product of flawed intelligence and a deep misunderstanding of French naval honor. They suggest that a more patient diplomatic approach could have achieved the same result without the bloodshed. For them, Mers El-Kébir wasn't a strategic mass. It was a tragic blunder, an act that alienated a potential ally and needlessly sacrificed lives, forever complicating the narrative of Britain's finest hour. This chasm in perception had a profound and lasting impact on Franco-British relations for decades after the war. The Perfide Albion, or Perfidious Albion, a centuries-old French caricature of British treachery, was given a fresh and painful new relevance. For Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, the attack was a personal and political nightmare. While he publicly understood Britain's motives, privately, He was aghast. The incident made his task of rallying Frenchmen to his cause infinitely harder. How could he convince his countrymen to fight alongside the very nation that had just fired on their brothers? This tension simmered long after 1945. It colored diplomatic negotiations, military cooperation within NATO, and even Britain's repeated attempts to join the European Economic Community, which de Gaulle famously vetoed. The ghost of Mers El-Kébir haunted the corridors of power, a constant reminder of a moment when the alliance fractured. It took generations for the wound to begin to heal, for the shared sacrifice of the wider war to overshadow the bitterness of that one day. Joint naval exercises and shed memorials in the late 20th and early 21st centuries were not just symbolic. They were conscious efforts to mend a deep historical rift. So, where does that leave us? How do we judge the actions of that day? The truth is, there is no easy answer. Mers El-Kébir exists in a gray zone of history where necessity and morality collide. It is a story with no clear heroes or villains, only desperate men making impossible choices in the darkest of times. On one hand, you have the stark reality of Britain's position. The decision, however agonizing, demonstrated an iron will to survive that was crucial in the lonely summer of 1940. It showed Hitler that Britain was not a nation to be trifled with, that it would stop at nothing to continue the fight. In the cold calculus of war, it may well have been a key factor in convincing the United States that Britain was a viable ally worth supporting. On the other hand, you have the undeniable human tragedy, the lives lost, the trust shattered, the alliance stained. It serves as a chilling reminder that in war, the lines between friend and foe can blur with terrifying speed, and that the greater good is often paid for with the blood of those who deserved a different fate. Ultimately, the legacy of Mers El-Kébir is its complexity. It defies simple judgment. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities of total war, where leaders are forced to weigh the lives of allies against the survival of their nation. It remains one of the most controversial, painful, and defining moments of the Second World War, a brutal testament to Britain's resolve, a permanent scar on the soul of France, and a timeless lesson on the terrible price of victory.